All right, in that last video there, we talked about the parts of a neuron and how the impulse traveled from the dendrites through the cell body toward the axon hillock, and then down the axon toward the axon terminals toward its target. So there was an input and an output, and today we'll kind of relate that to the types of neurons, the functional types. Before that, I want to look at some of the gross anatomy of the nervous system, because some of the language we use will be important when we talk about where, that is, the location of these certain types of neurons are. All right, so next, let's look at the so-called organization. When we're looking inside a slice of the brain, we see things like this butterfly-shaped thing surrounded by this lighter shade stuff. So this would be going to refer to as gray matter and white matter. And that gray matter and white matter is going to be, we know what's in them, right? In the gray matter, and the white matter rather, is going to be all those myelinated axons, right? Again, that's just cabling, just like we saw, well, we will see in the nerves, right? It's just going to be pure cabling, information traveling from one part of the brain to the other fast, right? Long distance. They could talk to each other locally, but when they want to talk from one part of the body to another, they're going to myelinate, and they're going to go through this white matter over here. Whereas all the information processing is going on in the gray matter over here, right? This would be the cell bodies and the dendrites of the neurons. The glial cells will be everywhere. Cell bodies, dendrites, gray matter. Myelinated axons, white matter. So here's the spinal cord section. Over here would be all cell bodies and neurons. In the brain, you're going to have a strip on the outside layer called the cerebral cortex. That's going to be all cell bodies and dendrites and unmyelinated axons, and a couple of clusters of cells within the white matter. And then we're going to see that, information, just all this stuff is passing information maybe down, maybe across, maybe between different regions right there. Right? And for this one, here's all the cell bodies and stuff, information processing going on. This is just information going up and down the spinal cord. So this is all going to be oligodendrocytes and myelinated axons in this white matter part. All right, so the gray matter, sensory and motor nuclei. And notice the word, again, another word to kind of pick up on over here. Nuclei. That's a group of neurons in the cell body. Right? So that might be a nuclei over here, a different nuclei here, a different nuclei here, different nuclei here. And that just means a group of cells, right, that are in the gray matter, in the central nervous system. And then again, you also have tracks of axons going up toward the brain over here, right, in the white matter, going up toward the brain and coming down from the brain. Right, so these are all this is all representing myelinated, different tracks of myelinated axons going from the brain. So that's white matter, even though it's green and blue. All the stuff on the outside here is white matter. All right, gray matter, white matter, cell bodies and dendrites versus myelinated axons. It looks white because that fatty layer that's surrounding it is basically fat. That's why it kind of looks white. All right, so for nuclei, right, remember those motor nuclei that were controlling your arm, a particular arm, you had a group of them controlling certain motor units. Right? You'd see them in this certain region over here, right? You'd have motor nuclei, right, of the so-called ventral horn over here. All the way down the spinal cord, you'd have little groups. This would control your neck muscles or something like that, or your deltoid muscles. These might be doing your forearm muscles or something like that. Right? These would be clusters of motor nuclei going down the spinal cord right here. Nuclei, groups of cells, and this one is controlling a very specific area of the arm. This one is controlling another one. Right? So groups of cell bodies in the central nervous system, like these three over here, are called a nuclei. Myelinated axons, bundles of myelinated axons, like this, coming from the brain over here, going through the brain, tracks of white matter, going down all through the spinal cord. That's going to be tracks. That's the language we're going to use for these two things inside the central nervous system. Because when we get to the peripheral nervous system, we'll see a group of cell bodies called the ganglia. So right outside the spinal cord, you have what's called the dorsal root ganglia full of sensory neurons. That's a group of cell bodies that are kind of have something in common, but they're called a ganglia instead of a nuclei. And then bundles of axons, myelinated axons, instead of being a tract, that's basically what your nerves are, bundles of myelinated axons. And so just be cautious of that language when we talk about them. They have slightly different language, slightly different meanings, but generally cell bodies and axons. Ganglia and nerves, or nuclei and tracts. Peripheral central nervous system. The next part is this structural classification of neurons, these different shapes that neurons may take. And these are going to be highly associated with a particular function. So I'm really going to focus on them. But you will see these words like multipolar. That is, unlike this bipolar, you have different sort of poles on each end of the cell body. A single dendrite coming in here, a single axon leaving, branching off from over here onto a single dendrite. You'll find these in the eyeball, right? Certain sensory neurons. Most of your interneurons are something more like this. Your motor neurons are something like this. These are the ones I showed in the example. Dendrites come onto the cell body, a single axon leaves that cell body, and then it branches off into this, into these axon terminals. That's a multipolar. This is going to be more like your sensory neuron, right? The cell body isn't really going to be doing much. The dendrites are all picking up from sensory receptors. They all merge at the hillock or your trigger zone right here. This is the beginning of the axon, right? If the input is strong enough, it fires that off, sends it down the axon, past the cell body, doesn't really do anything with it, and then sends it into the axon terminal. All right, so it's all really a relationship between the cell body and the dendrites and the axons, right? As far as these classifications. Again, I'm going to be more concerned about the functional classification. So for this functional one, you'll notice there's a correspondent. This is that pseudo-unipolar neuron, right? We have sensory receptors, dendrites, leading into an axon, passing by the cell body, and then going into the axon terminals. And then this is going to be bringing information from a sensory receptor or the end fibers. The axon is going to come in, bring that sensory information, and it's going to pass it on to either a motor or an interneuron. That's your sensory information coming in, input. And the fact that it's getting sensory information and passing it on to another neuron makes it a sensory neuron. That's its functional classification. This cell over here, the fact that it's getting information from another neuron and then passing it to another neuron makes it an interneuron. Right? So who is it talking to? It's talking to another neuron and it's passing it on. This one is getting its information from another neuron. That's good. It's getting information from, but it's passing it on. It's going out to the periphery to affect the muscles. So that makes this a motor neuron. All right, so who are you talking to? Where are you getting your information from? What's your input? What's your output? That makes your functional classification. Right? Functional classification based on neurons input, output. If you're getting your information from sensory receptors, right, over here, then you're a sensory neuron. If you're getting your information from other neurons, you're an interneuron. As long as you are passing out to other neurons. If you're getting information from other neurons and passing it out to a effector, then you're a motor neuron, right? Input, output. That's the functional classification. A word about the interneurons, right? Interneurons make up all the 99% of your central nervous system neurons, right? So you're getting information in from the environment, you're doing something with it, but most of what's going on in your brain is just bouncing signals around to each other and trying to figure out what's going on, interpret it, analyze it, make something of it. This is the job of the interneurons right here, right? They're located entirely within the brain and spinal cord. You will not find these in the periphery. They're located between sensory and motor neurons, or between other interneurons. In most cases, that's what they are, because most neurons are interneurons. They're responsible for all the integrative function of the nervous system, right? The analysis of sensory input and the coordination of motor outputs. And all the heavy thinking stuff. And they can either excite the next cell or inhibit the next cell. And for all the 90% of the cells that are neurons, most of those are actually inhibitory neurons for some reason. They're stopping a cell from doing something, right? And that's going to be based on what kind of synapse they have and everything. We'll get into that. Excitatory, inhibitory. And again, they make up the vast majority of central nervous systems. Right? You only have a small pool of motor neurons in the spinal cord, and then your sensory neurons are actually outside, as we'll see. Right? So the functional classification, where it's getting its information from, who it's talking to, who it's getting information from, who it's talking to. Makes you sensory, interneuron, and motor neuron. So the location, bringing up to our next subject here, the location of these neurons gets a little tricky because they're all over the place, right? They might have their dendrites out in your fingertips and their terminals in your spinal cord, or vice versa, right? So we're going to look at the location of these three types of neurons. I already told you interneurons within the central nervous system, right? So this is a neuron, a cell body, and dendrites might be in the uppermost part of your brain over there. Its axon goes down your brain, through the brainstem, through the spinal cord, and goes all the way down your spinal cord. So this axon might be, 2 or 3 feet long or longer, right? Or this might be one in the spinal cord that goes out to your big toe, right? Cell body might be in the spinal cord. Its terminal boutons might be 3 feet away. So the location of the different parts are going to be in different places of your body, right? So over here, we have a sensory receptor over here, and your dendrites pick it up. Axon goes over here. Cell body happens to be hanging out right outside the spinal cord, and then its axon continues in and goes up here. Now, that's a single neuron, right? Whereas your motor neuron is going to be located somewhere, let's say in your spinal cord over here. It's going to send out its axon down over here and then all the way out there. Right? This is, a tiny, tiny little cell, right? But it's like, could be 3 feet long, 4 feet long. No, probably not 4 feet, but you get the idea, right? A very, very long axon right here. All right, so cell body could be in the central nervous system. Its terminal boutons could be in the periphery, and vice versa for this. Dendrites way out there, cell body close to over here. And then your rest of your axon might be in the central nervous system, right? So as a summary of what we're looking at, the sensory neurons, its dendrites are out, right? In the skin of your arm over here, but your cell body is not by there. It's going to be a little bit protected right close to the spinal cord. As we'll see, this is called the dorsal root ganglia because it's a group of cells, a group of cell bodies, so that's called a ganglia. That's also outside the spinal cord. Right? And then the axon goes through all the way up your arm, through your thing on there, and then it goes into your central nervous system inside the spinal cord. That'll be the location of these three parts. Your interneurons completely within the gray and white matter of your central nervous system. And then your motor neuron starts in the central nervous system, the dendrites and cell body. Its axon a little bit in the central nervous system, then quickly gets out into the periphery, out to its target right here. All right, so those are the location of those guys here, right? Right, interneuron completely within there. So, all right, here we go. Let's just take another look at this, same kind of thing, looking at individual cells right here, the different parts of the body, the multipolar, which would be an interneuron or motor neuron, and then the so-called pseudo-unipolar neuron over here, right? Dendrites, cell bodies, axon, hillox, axon, where are they? The receptive region, where it's picking up information, for your interneurons and motor neurons, again, are in the gray matter of the spinal cord and brain, gray matter. Whereas your receptive region, where it's picking up information, is out in the periphery, somewhere in your peripheral nervous system. The axon hillock, the trigger zone, in this case, is going to be right at the end of all those before it sends it down the axon. Whereas the axon hillock of your inter and motor neurons are right at the end of your cell body right there, summoning all the information. Trigger zone, right? The conductive region, the axon for your interneurons, again, stays entirely within the central nervous system. This starts off the cell body, but then just quickly goes out into your peripheral nervous system. Your axon for your sensory neurons starts at the end of the axon, since the end of the axon hillock, goes through, passes right by your cell body, and then enters the spinal cord, that whole conductive region, right? And then your so-called secretory region, where you're going to transmit the neurotransmitter, like acetylcholine or something, is going to be, again, your central nervous system here. It's going to be out on the muscles for your motor neuron, out in the periphery. And then this has entered the spinal cord to talk to mostly other interneurons. So that's your relationship of the anatomy to the functional region. So once again, recap this. This is near the end here. I'm getting near the end. Brain, spinal cord, right? Central nervous system, and then the cabling, right? Into and out of the nervous system, just passing on signals over there. Remember the words, right? Information input to the nervous system. You're going to starts with receptor, sensory neurons, afferent fibers, and then it's going to go up ascending tracks up to the brain right there. The other pathway is going to start in your brain somewhere, and it's going to go down those descending tracks pathway. Going to go out efferent fibers, right, through those motor neurons to reach an effector. And that's the basic stuff and everything that goes along with it. So when you're trying to study, right, make little sheets like this where you can name every single thing along the way. Dendrites over here. What is it myelinated by? Schwann cells. What's over here? The cell body of your motor neuron. What's it myelinated? Whatever, right? Just as much information you can. We're going to add to this as it goes along right here. But always keep these pathways in mind. It's the easiest way to organize the nervous system, pathways. All right. So in summary, we have a complicated chart right over here. Again, many ways to make this. Central nervous system, brain, spinal cord, peripheral nervous system. Right? So signals, right, picked up by sensory receptors of some sort. Sensory neurons bring it into the brain for integration. Right? And then efferent neurons are going to put out that information, right? So that is the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system and everything, tissues within it. Then in the next lecture, we're going to look at the individual neurons and the electrical nature of them, how they use that electrical nature to generate electric currents, both locally and then passing from one neuron to another. All right, we'll see you next time.